So we've already learned about the progressive reformers who really were pushing for big sweeping changes to governments throughout the United States, both at the local, county, and state levels, as well as, and especially as, in fact, the federal government. What is the government's response to that, however? Are they going to listen to these progressive reformers? And are they going to listen to the American people? Because some of the ideas of these progressive reformers are very popular among the American people. Some political reforms do happen due to the overwhelming support of the American people. Average citizens are sick and tired of political bosses like Boss Tweed in New York City. And they believe that the progressive reformers have the right idea of taking power back away from these political bosses. A few of the ways that they did this. One, a direct primary. Instead of state conventions, which is really just a collection of powerful politicians choosing candidates, a primary election was held. Primary meaning the first. So the first election is held. And today, the way primaries work at the local, county, and state levels is that a September election is held, and those are the primaries. If a primary is even necessary. Sometimes somebody does get unanimous support of their political party. However, if a primary is necessary, it happens in September. Then the general election, where candidates are actually put into office, happens in November. The only primary elections that happen sooner than September are the presidential primaries, and they happen the spring before the November elections to give those presidential candidates more time to campaign for the presidency. The initiative. This means that state legislatures can be forced to consider a law proposed by a petition signed by a small percentage of citizens. So let's say the town of Lafayette wanted to have a certain law passed. They could gather together all of the citizens of Lafayette to sign a petition and send it to the county legislature in Syracuse. Could also be done at the state level, which would require probably multiple counties, not just individual townships. But this requires the government to actually discuss a certain issue. They don't necessarily have to take action on that issue, but in many cases, an initiative is used by the citizens when their normal calls to action by the government are ignored. So if the government is ignoring the people asking for a certain issue to be discussed, then an initiative is sometimes necessary to force them to discuss it. A referendum. This means that a particular issue is left up to the people. This is very similar, it's actually really the same exact thing, as the whole idea of popular sovereignty during the pre-Civil War period. If you remember, Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln disagreed strongly about whether people should be able to vote on whether to allow slavery in new territories. It's just any particular issue can utilize the referendum process where the citizens of, say, a state can decide the legality of something in their state. A recall. If a politician is considered just so above and beyond corrupt, citizens can force a new election before the regular cycle is supposed to force a re-election of someone. Recently, a recall election actually did happen in the state of Wisconsin. Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin was very unpopular with the labor unions in particular in Wisconsin. He was recalled, he did stay in office, and then a year or two later, he won a re-election campaign for governor. That was his regular cycle, however. The recall election was sooner than he was scheduled to have to run for re-election. And it was because so many citizens of the state of Wisconsin disliked him, thought he was very corrupt, and therefore wanted him recalled. It didn't work out for them, but they at least utilized the ability to recall what they believed to be a corrupt politician. The secret ballot. This is huge. Because prior to this, sometimes elections are held where there's the box for the one candidate and the box for the other candidate, and you slide your paper ballot down into the box of the candidate you support. Industrial factory workers are a little nervous of doing that. They are terrified, in fact, of doing that because What if their boss is watching? What if their manager or foreman is watching? They could lose their job. And there really aren't the same job loss protections that there are today in this time period. So people truly have to be afraid of people knowing the way they vote. A secret ballot allowed them to step into a voting booth in order to vote. And that is secret. Here's just a cartoon of a voting booth, but also a yard sign. There is a tax referendum being voted on in whatever township that this was proposed in. So the people themselves were getting to choose whether they wanted a change to their taxes. And this yard sign, the person obviously does not support the change to their taxes. Teddy Roosevelt, considered probably one of the most progressive politicians in U.S. history. For most of U.S. history, the laissez-faire philosophy keeps the government out of the affairs of the economy. The economy regulates itself. Some decisions of the government, however, even sided with big business. If there was a question, it always defaulted to what benefited big business. Teddy Roosevelt, however, believes in the stewardship theory. And this means that the president is responsible for guiding the nation's political and economic affairs. In one example, in 1902, there was a coal mining strike going on, and Teddy Roosevelt invited the two sides, the labor union leadership as well as the business owner and his lawyers, to the White House, and there was an agreement reached that both sides could be happy with. This is often referred to as arbitration when you do it with only lawyers. In this case, the president got involved, but Teddy Roosevelt really believed in this stewardship theory and that he was responsible for trying to sort out some of the economic turmoil in the country, not just political turmoil. Here's a photograph of Teddy Roosevelt. Like I said, considered one of the most progressive politicians in our nation's history. Business regulation. Roosevelt, because he is one of the most progressive politicians ever, is known as the trust buster. He gets this nickname because he puts pressure on what he refers to as bad trusts, but allowed trusts that acted responsibly, in his opinion, good trusts, to operate freely. Some examples. The Elkins Act in 1903 punished railroads that provided special favors to companies that did a lot of business with them. Remember that John D. Rockefeller made a deal with railroad tycoons like Cornelius Vanderbilt to ship his oil very cheaply. And he got much better deals on sending his oil around the country than smaller businesses or the common citizen just riding a train were paying. This made that illegal. The Hepburn Act in 1906. This allows the Interstate Commerce Commission to fix the rates that railroads charged for their services, and it restricted free passes to politicians or business owners. So no more favors to politicians or business owners, and the government can decide how much the railroad is allowed to charge. More business regulation. We've already discussed when we mentioned Upton Sinclair and the writing of the book The Jungle, the Meat Inspection Act, and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Remember, this is directly the result of Upton Sinclair writing his book. Roosevelt calls his targeting of only these bad trusts as his rule of reason. In this political cartoon, he's being criticized because he's killed one bear while allowing others to live, and the question came about, what gives Teddy Roosevelt the authority to pick and choose who is good and who is bad? Nonetheless, many of these laws were very popular among the American people. Roosevelt, if not known for his progressivism, is also very well known for his conservationism and his belief in conserving the natural environment. He utilized the Forest Reserve Act to establish 149 national forests covering over 190 million acres total. That is massive. He also promoted 2 laws into Congress with his director of the Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, which is pictured with Teddy Roosevelt here. The New Land Reclamation Act in 1902. All money made from the sale of western desert lands would be spent on irrigation projects. This is pretty popular among the American people because when and if the government sold off land that was desert land, they could reuse that money into irrigation projects providing water for western farmers as well as just drinking water for the average person. He also promoted a second law, the Inland Waterways Act in 1907. This was a commission that was created to study the use of the nation's major rivers. And this becomes important when beginning to expand the use of hydroelectric power. Woodrow Wilson. If Teddy Roosevelt was not called the most progressive politician in American history, the only other person who could possibly be considered more progressive than Teddy is Woodrow Wilson. Quick story here. Teddy Roosevelt decides to leave office. He encourages the Republican Party to support his friend, William Howard Taft, and they do. But Taft does not live up to the same progressive legacy that Teddy Roosevelt had. This makes Teddy very mad, so he runs as a third-party candidate. And so Democrat Woodrow Wilson easily wins the 1912 presidential election because the Republican vote, had it only gone to one candidate, the Republican would have won, but Taft and Roosevelt are splitting that vote. This is very similar to the way that Abraham Lincoln gets elected president just before the Civil War. The electoral vote was divided 4 ways in 1860. In this case, in 1912, it's divided 3 ways. Once he takes office, Wilson enacts his new wave of policies that he refers to as the New Freedom. He wants to lower tariffs. He wants more economic activity worldwide. So if he lowers tariffs on foreign goods coming into the United States, he can assure that more goods are going to be moving into and out of the United States. He thinks this will spur economic growth. He wants more regulation on business to stop corruption. And he wants to reform the banking system so that the monetary system can be regulated by the government. These second 2 things are much more controversial than the lower tariffs. This is a photograph of Woodrow Wilson. The Underwood Tariff in 1913, this is what cuts the tariff rate by the largest percentage in decades. It also helps establish the income tax. Now, rates at 1% up to an income of $20,000. And 7% for all incomes above $500,000. I'll show you a chart in a few moments that adjusts that for inflation so that we can kind of put into perspective what the dollar amounts in today's dollar value are. So according to these rates, those below $20,000, which at this time is 99% of the population, paid 4% of the overall taxes in the United States in 1913. Those above $20,000, which was only 1% of the population, paid 96% of the nation's taxes in 1913. So the wealthy are paying 96% of the burden of income taxes. So the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. In order for the Underwood Tariff to be constitutional, there had to be an amendment. So the Graduated Income Tax Amendment in 1913 allowed for this to be considered legal. Graduated income tax just means that the more money you make, the more you're taxed. So again, look at this chart. 1913 income. Anything below $20,000, you pay a 1% tax rate. In today's dollars, that means anyone making less than $440,399 pays a 1% tax. I can tell you that I desperately wish I paid 1% in federal income taxes. I pay more like 25% in federal income taxes. And it gets progressively more as the thresholds increase. A 1% surcharge, 2% surcharge, 3% surcharge, 4%, 5%, and 6%. The absolute highest level of taxation was 7%. Today, 2016, that number, the highest number, is 39.6%. And again, if you look at an adjusted for inflation 2010 dollars, the top tax rate, which back then was over $500,000, adjusted for inflation, over $11 million. Things have changed a lot since then. That was what made the 16th Amendment so controversial at the time, because many were saying if you give the government a little taste of how much money they can get, they will want so much more over time. And that's obviously true, because instead of 1%, I pay about 25% of my income in federal income taxes, and I make a heck of a lot less than the adjusted for inflation number of $440, $399. Now, the Federal Reserve and Federal Trade Commission. Both of these things were government regulation on the economy, and that's one of the goals of Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom. The Federal Reserve creates a body to regulate the money supply. This is kind of similar to Alexander Hamilton's National Bank Plan, but in this case it gives the federal government even more power to regulate the money supply in the sense of printing more money, which would inflate the nation's currency. That should also sound familiar. If you remember William Jennings Bryan, when he was running as a Populist Party candidate for president, he promoted the free coinage of silver. And the free coinage of silver would have inflated the nation's money supply. And when the Federal Reserve prints more money, it inflates the nation's money supply. And then the Federal Trade Commission in 1914, this creates the FTC and gives it the power to investigate businesses suspected of operating in an unfair way, as well as issue orders to any company to cease and desist any illegal behavior defined in antitrust laws. So this is a very, very expansive power that the federal government is gaining here. A couple of more things that gave American citizens so much more power to change the government. The direct election of senators. State legislatures used to choose senators, but in 1913 there was the 17th Amendment saying that people would now directly vote on their senators as they do many other things. So today you can actually vote on the 2 senators representing your state in the federal government. And then women's suffrage. Women gained the right to vote. Many Western states had already given women the right to vote, but the 19th Amendment in 1919 and becoming law in 1920 officially gave women the right to vote. Woodrow Wilson, he is extremely racist and does absolutely nothing to advance the right of black Americans throughout this 8 years as president. He even expanded segregation in Washington, D.C. So while women are gaining the right to vote, blacks are actually taking steps backwards during Woodrow Wilson's presidency. That is the end of the presentation. Please make sure that you are taking the online quiz. Use your notes, because if you use your notes, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to get a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.